Vicky speaking. Detail assistance. Vicky speaking. How can I help you?
Hey, we're at the west tip of Horn, and our bilge pump stopped working. We're sinking. Can you all please come? We have a membership.
All right, of course. How far is the water coming up, sir? Can you give me a description? Ankles? Hello?
What'd you say?
Yes. How far is the water coming up, sir?
It's coming up. We're just sinking. I don't know. Like we're going down.
All right. Well, let's get you going. Membership number or phone number listed on the account, sir.
I don't know the phone number. It's either Jerry Atkerson. I think it's Jerry Atkerson. Try that.
All right.
I know we have a membership, like guaranteed. I don't have the tag
Unless
on
you
here.
have a membership number or anything, it's okay. I'll get you over to the captain. What's the best phone number to reach you at?
Reach me at 2.
All right. And is everybody on board in good health otherwise?
Yeah, everybody's
How
on
many?
board.
All right. Do you need the United States Coast Guard?
What?
Do you need the United States Coast Guard?
No, we do not need that.
All right. All right. Do you have your current GPS coordinates?
Let me go look.
If not, I can send you a text message.
No, we do not have the VHF radio.
All right. Well, let's try to get you going because you don't have good cell phone reception. Can you verify your coordinates one more time?
Okay, my coordinates are 30 degrees by 14.684 north, and then west by 88 degrees by 46.79.
Right. Looks like you're on Horn Island, correct? Are you
Yes,
on
we are
Horn
at Horn
Island?
Island. Yes.
All right. Is the boat sinking or you have it aground?
We were sinking, yes.
For months, one question has refused to go away. What really happened after the boat left Horn Island? Investigators have spent countless hours piecing together the timeline. Witnesses have given statements. GPS records have been downloaded. Phone calls have been reviewed. And yet, some of the most important questions remain unanswered. Now, a newly released distress call is giving the public its first opportunity to hear what was happening aboard that boat in real time. At first, the recording sounds exactly as you would expect. A group of young people. A boat taking on water. A frantic request for help. But as investigators and now the public listen more closely, some believe the background audio tells a different story. Not because of what the caller says, but because of what others may be saying behind him. If those voices have been interpreted correctly, they could raise entirely new questions about the timeline investigators have been trying to reconstruct.
Connect you.
Detail assistance. Vicky speaking. How can I help you?
Hey, we're at the west tip of Horn, and our bilge pump stopped working. We're sinking. Can you all please come? We have a membership.
All right. Of course. How far is the water coming up, sir? Can you give me a description? Ankles?
What'd
Hello?
you say? Hey.
Yes. How far is the water coming up, sir?
It's coming up. We're just sinking. I don't know. Like we're going down now.
Questions that cannot be answered by speculation, only by evidence. And the distress call is only the beginning. Because once investigators compared that audio with GPS records, official reports, and later witness interviews, a series of inconsistencies began to emerge. Were they innocent misunderstandings, the result of confusion during an emergency, or signs that important pieces of this investigation have yet to be fully explained? Tonight, we're going to walk through the evidence exactly as it became available. Not rumors, not internet theories, documents, recordings, GPS data, witness statements, And the questions investigators and now the public continue asking. Because sometimes, the biggest breakthrough isn't finding a new piece of evidence. It's realizing two existing pieces don't seem to fit together. And in this investigation, that may be exactly where the story begins. Before examining the newly released distress call, it's important to understand what investigators were trying to reconstruct. Every investigation begins with a timeline. Not because a timeline answers every question, but because it often reveals the questions that matter most. According to official records, the group departed for Horn Island during the morning of July 4th. The trip itself wasn't unusual. Horn Island is a familiar destination along Mississippi's Gulf Coast. For boaters, it's a place to spend the day fishing, swimming, or simply escaping the mainland for a few hours. Nothing about that morning appeared extraordinary. The boat arrived at the island. The group remained there for several hours. And according to later GPS records, the vessel stayed almost completely stationary during that time. That detail matters, because GPS systems don't just record destinations. They record movement, speed, direction, stops. Sometimes, those digital tracks become more reliable than human memory, especially when memories begin to conflict. At this point in the investigation, there was no reason to believe the timeline was anything other than straightforward. A group arrives. They spend the afternoon on the island. Later, something goes terribly wrong. But investigators quickly discovered something that complicated the picture. The emergency wasn't reported through 911. It wasn't first reported through the Coast Guard. Instead, someone aboard the boat contacted a commercial towing service. That decision immediately raises an important question. Why? If a vessel is genuinely taking on water, time matters. Emergency responders have resources specifically designed for life-threatening situations. Yet during the call, the Coast Guard was offered. The answer came quickly. No. At the time, that response may not have seemed unusual. Boat owners decline assistance for many reasons. Sometimes they believe they can solve the problem themselves. Sometimes they're worried about cost. Sometimes they simply don't believe the situation is as serious as it sounds. Standing alone, that answer doesn't prove anything. But investigations rarely rely on one detail. They rely on patterns. And this call contains several. The operator begins asking routine questions. Location, boat description, water depth, membership information. How many people are on board? Simple questions. Questions every dispatcher asks. Yet several answers appear uncertain. The caller struggles to provide information. There are pauses, confusion, background voices, moments where the conversation briefly loses focus. Again, none of this is necessarily suspicious. Stress affects memory. Emergencies create confusion. People panic. Investigators know that, which is exactly why they rarely focus on a single statement. Instead, they compare every statement against independent evidence. That's where this investigation begins to change. Because while the caller is speaking with dispatch, other voices can be heard. Most are difficult to understand. Some are impossible to identify with certainty. Audio quality matters. Background noise matters. Interpretation matters. Responsible investigators never assume they hear something simply because they expect to. Instead, they isolate, review, compare, listen again, sometimes dozens of times. That's exactly what many people began doing after this recording became public. Some listeners reported hearing Nolan's name. Others disagreed. Some believed they heard someone asking whether someone was dead. Others heard completely different words. This is an important distinction. Background audio is often subjective. People hear different things. Without enhanced forensic audio analysis, those interpretations remain exactly that. Interpretations, not established facts. But here's why investigators would still pay attention. Even uncertain audio can point investigators toward questions worth asking. Not because it proves anything, but because it may suggest where additional evidence should be examined. If multiple people independently report hearing similar phrases, that can become one more reason to compare the recording with witness statements. And that's exactly where another question emerges. Because public accounts have indicated that Nolan never returned aboard that vessel. Yet some listeners believe the background voices suggest otherwise. Does the recording confirm that? No, not on its own. Could it justify additional forensic review? Absolutely. And that's an important difference. Good investigations don't begin with conclusions. They begin with questions. As the call continues, another detail quietly enters the timeline. One that would later become far more significant than it first appeared. The boat's location. The caller provides GPS coordinates.
Okay, my coordinates are 30 degrees by 14.684 north, and then west by 88 degrees by 46.79.
Right, looks like you're on Horn Island, correct? Are you
Yes,
on
we are
Horn
at Horn
Island?
Island. Yeah.
Dispatch verifies them. The location appears consistent with the western end of Horn Island. At first glance, nothing unusual. But GPS coordinates do something witness memories cannot. They anchor a moment in time. Investigators now know where the boat reportedly was during the call. The next challenge becomes determining where it went afterward. That answer wouldn't come from the distress call. It would come from another source entirely. The boat itself. Modern marine electronics record extraordinary amounts of information. Routes, drags, speeds, waypoints. Every movement leaves a digital footprint. Unlike eyewitness testimony, GPS doesn't become nervous. It doesn't forget. It doesn't speculate. It simply records. And when investigators later downloaded that information, they discovered a timeline that would become one of the most closely examined pieces of evidence in this entire case. Because once those digital tracks were laid over satellite imagery, they didn't just show where the boat had been. They revealed exactly when it moved, when it stopped, and where investigators needed to look next. And that's where the investigation takes its first major turn. Not because the GPS answers every question, but because it introduces new ones. Questions that become even more difficult to ignore once those movements are compared with later interviews. The distress call had opened one door. The GPS records were about to open another. And together, they would begin painting a far more complicated picture than anyone initially expected. The distress call lasted only a few minutes. But investigations aren't measured by minutes. They're measured by moments. Sometimes, a single sentence becomes more important than everything said before it. This call contains several. At first, the conversation follows a predictable pattern. The dispatcher asks about the boat, the water level, its location, the number of people on board. Nothing that immediately suggests wrongdoing. Just moments where the conversation doesn't quite flow. The caller struggles to answer basic questions. Reporting. The dispatcher asks a simple question. Do you need the United States Coast Guard? The answer comes almost immediately. No. It's impossible to know what was going through the caller's mind in that moment. Perhaps they believed the situation was under control. Perhaps they expected the bilge pump issue to be temporary. Perhaps they thought commercial assistance would arrive first. Investigators can't simply guess. But they can ask whether later events support that decision. That's where the timeline becomes increasingly important. Because emergencies evolve. A situation that appears manageable at one moment can become critical only minutes later. So investigators don't just ask what someone believed during the call. They compare those beliefs against what happened afterward. The next exchange is equally revealing. The dispatcher asks how many people are aboard. The response isn't immediate. At first, the caller appears confused by the wording. He responds that there are 0 adults. Then explains no one is over 21. Technically, that answers a different question. The dispatcher has to clarify. Again. Finally. The answer comes. Approximately 7 people.
Hello. Okay.
How many
what's
adults
going
on board?
So, there are 0 adults on board.
There's nobody on board the boat?
No. Nobody
right.
here is over the age of 21.
Sir, that was not the question. Is there a person? Is there a person, a living individual on the boat?
It seems like a minor misunderstanding. And it probably is. But experienced investigators document even moments like this. Not because they indicate deception. Because they reveal the conditions under which later statements were made. Stress. Noise. Distraction. Confusion. Those factors matter when evaluating witness reliability. Then, something else catches attention. Not the caller. The background. Throughout the recording, other voices drift in and out. Some are clear enough to recognize as conversation. Others are buried beneath wind, movement, and overlapping speech. This is where caution becomes essential. Human brains are remarkably good at finding patterns. 2 people can listen to the exact same recording and hear entirely different words. That's why forensic audio specialists use enhancement software, spectral analysis, and repeated comparison before offering conclusions. Without that process, background interpretations remain tentative. Still, they can point investigators toward additional questions. Some listeners believe they hear someone calling Nolan's name. Others disagree completely. Some believe they hear someone asking whether someone is dead. Others hear nothing resembling those words. At this stage, the recording does not resolve those disagreements. Instead, it creates a new investigative question. Should the audio receive additional forensic examination? That's a question investigators, not internet speculation, must ultimately answer. Because if enhanced analysis identifies words with greater confidence, those findings would need to be compared against every known statement in the case. Not to confirm a theory. To test one. Good investigations work by attempting to disprove assumptions, not reinforce them. Then another detail quietly enters the picture. One that initially seems almost insignificant. The caller requests that the boat be towed. Not abandoned. Not evacuated. Towed. That wording suggests something important. Despite describing a serious mechanical problem, the expectation still appears to be that the vessel itself can be recovered. Again, nothing unusual. Boaters often think first about saving their vessel, especially if they believe everyone aboard is safe. But context matters, because later in the investigation, the movements of that same vessel become one of the central points investigators examine. And those movements begin only after this call ends. The dispatcher eventually transfers the caller to a local captain. What follows is one of the most overlooked portions of the recording. While arranging assistance, the local captain mentions something unexpected. He has already spoken with the boat's owner, or at least someone believed to be the owner. And according to that conversation, assistance may no longer be needed. That changes everything. Only minutes earlier, the caller sounded convinced the boat was taking on water. Now, someone else is reportedly saying they have the situation under control. What happened between those conversations? Did the bilge pump begin working again? Was the water removed? Did someone else arrive? Or was the danger never as severe as initially believed? The distress call doesn't answer those questions. It simply documents that the situation appears to have changed. And every change in an investigation deserves explanation. Not because change implies misconduct. Because unexplained change creates uncertainty. The captain eventually indicates he'll follow up directly. The call ends. For most people listening casually, that's where the story would end as well. But investigators don't stop when recordings end. They ask a different question. Can the timeline be verified independently? Fortunately, in this case, there was another witness. One that never needed to be interviewed. The Garmin GPS system. When investigators downloaded that information, They weren't looking for opinions. They were looking for facts. Coordinates. Timestamps. Movement. Because once those digital records were compared with interviews, the investigation entered an entirely new phase. The distress call had established one version of events. The GPS records would establish another. Whether those two versions aligned would become one of the most important questions in the entire case. And in the next stage of the investigation, investigators would discover that the boat's digital footprint was far more detailed than anyone expected. It wasn't just a route. It was a minute-by-minute reconstruction of where the vessel went. And perhaps, where investigators needed to look next. Every investigation reaches a moment when evidence stops answering questions and starts asking them. For this case, that moment arrived when investigators examined the GPS data recovered from the boats. The boat departed for Horn Island during the morning. It arrived without incident. For several hours, the GPS remained almost completely stationary. At approximately 4:30 p.m., the digital track shows the boat leaving the western tip of Horn Island. The GPS track continues. The vessel heads back toward the mainland, eventually arriving near the residence associated with Eli Jackson's grandparents. If the timeline ended there, there would be little mystery. According to the GPS data, the boat doesn't remain at that location. Instead, it departs again, heading into Fort Bayou. That movement immediately becomes another point investigators must understand. Why return to the water? Why not secure the boat if the emergency had already passed? Was the trip related to the earlier mechanical issue? Or was there another explanation entirely? Again, the GPS offers no opinions, only coordinates. This is where investigations become increasingly complex. Every movement has countless possible explanations. Most are entirely innocent. Some are not. The job of investigators isn't to assume which explanation is correct. It's to determine which explanation is supported by evidence. Then comes another movement, another departure, another route. The vessel leaves again, travels southwest, turns toward Biloxi Bay, eventually arriving at the Fort Bayou boat launch before later being transported to a residence. Viewed on a map, those movements don't simply represent travel. They represent decisions. Every turn of the wheel reflects a choice someone made that afternoon. Why choose that route? Why stop there? Why continue afterward? Those are investigative questions, not conclusions, because context changes everything. Around the same time, public statements were beginning to emerge describing what happened after leaving the island. Those accounts would become critically important. Not because witness statements are inherently unreliable. Quite the opposite. Witnesses often provide essential context that GPS never can. Digital records may tell investigators where a boat traveled. Only the people aboard can explain what was happening during those movements. Unless their explanations conflict with independently recorded evidence. That's the comparison investigators now faced. Not audio versus opinion. Not rumor versus speculation. GPS versus recollection. And when those two sources are placed side by side, the timeline becomes much harder to ignore. One interview in particular would later draw significant public attention. During that account, the witness described returning to a friend's grandparents' house before later spending the evening with friends at a 4th of July gathering. On its face, nothing about that description appears remarkable. People often summarize events, especially after traumatic experiences. No interview captures every minute of an entire day. Investigators understand that. But investigators also ask another question. Does the summary account for the movements recorded by the GPS? If it does, the timeline is strengthened. If it doesn't, they need to understand why. Because sometimes, the difference is as simple as forgotten details. Other times, those missing details become central to the investigation. That's why digital evidence is so valuable. It doesn't replace witness testimony. It tests it, one against the other. piece by piece, minute by minute. By this stage, the investigation had evolved far beyond a distress call. It had become an exercise in reconstruction. A reconstruction built from coordinates, timestamps, official reports, and human memory. Each source telling part of the story, none telling all of it. And as investigators continued comparing those pieces, they found themselves returning to the same question. Not what happened, but whether every part of the publicly understood timeline could still be reconciled with the evidence now in front of them. Because the next comparison would prove to be the most important yet. Not between two GPS points, not between two witnesses, but between what was said afterward and what the digital evidence appears to show. That comparison would become one of the defining moments of this investigation. And it would leave investigators with questions that, even today, continue to be debated. Every investigation has a turning point. A moment when the evidence no longer exists in isolation. When separate pieces begin connecting. The distress call, the GPS records, the official reports. Each tells part of the story. But investigators aren't looking at those pieces individually. They're laying them side by side, looking for where they agree. And more importantly, where they don't. By now, the GPS had established something investigators could confidently rely upon. The boat left Horn Island. It traveled slowly for several miles, then resumed normal speed. It returned to the mainland. It later moved again. Those aren't opinions. They're digital records preserved during the investigation. But GPS can only answer one question. Where? That's where witness interviews become critical. Another witness. Security cameras. Cell phone records. Fuel purchases. Additional GPS devices. Modern investigations are built exactly this way. One piece of evidence leads to another. Rarely does one document solve an entire case. Instead, it tells investigators where to look next. That's why the official reports matter so much. They don't simply document what officers believed. They document what investigators chose to preserve. The towing captain's conversation suggested someone had communicated that the situation was under control.
Okay, thank you.
This is Captain Seth.
Hi, Captain Seth. This is Vicky from International. How you doing today?
Doing good. How are you?
Good, good. I apologize ahead of time. I really do. You're going to have a fee for service come up under Jerry.
Okay.
It sounds like a bunch of kids on board on Horn Island. He's letting me know that his father's a member, but he can't give me any information. And he's saying the boat is sinking, and he's on Horn Island. It's just unfortunate. He's just a kid. There's a lot going on. So
Right.
he said there's about a lot of people on board. He says he thinks about 7. I'm guessing they're all under 18.
Okay.
And I'm not trying to be rude. He wants you guys to go out there and unpump the boat and then tow it in.
Do you know what kind of boat it is?
He said a Triton 24-footer, but that's all he can give me.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I just actually got off the phone with his grandpa, who I'm guessing is the owner of the boat, and
Is it
he
Jerry?
said that Jerry. Yeah, he said.
Okay.
I just hung up with him. He said that they don't need any help right now, but if something changes, he'll call me back.
Investigatively. That matters. Not because declining assistance is unusual. Because investigators want to understand what information changed. Did conditions improve? Did someone successfully address the mechanical problem? Or did the people involved simply reassess the situation? Those answers may exist. They may already be known to investigators. Or they may remain part of the ongoing effort to reconstruct the day. The public simply doesn't know. And responsible reporting requires acknowledging that uncertainty. Another point deserves equal attention. Throughout this case, public discussion has often moved faster than verified evidence. Social media can be a valuable source of tips. It can also amplify assumptions. Experienced investigators understand the difference. Every claim must be tested. Every timeline verified. Every recording authenticated. Every statement compared against objective evidence. Because once an assumption enters an investigation unchecked, it becomes much harder to separate fact from speculation. That's why digital evidence remains so important. It doesn't have opinions. It doesn't follow online discussions. It simply records. And in this investigation, those records became the foundation for nearly every question that followed. Yet one challenge remained. Even with GPS data, investigators still couldn't see what happened aboard the vessel. Coordinates don't reveal conversations. They don't identify passengers. They don't explain decisions. For that, investigators must rely on interviews, physical evidence, forensic analysis, and corroboration. It's like assembling a 1,000-piece puzzle. The GPS provides the border. The distress call fills in another section. Witnesses contribute additional pieces. But until enough pieces connect, the full picture remains incomplete. That's where this investigation stood. Not solved. Not stalled. But moving into a phase where every statement would be weighed against every available record. And that's when investigators encountered perhaps the most difficult question of all. Not whether the boat traveled where the GPS indicated. It clearly did. The real question became whether every account given afterward fully explained those movements. Because if even one portion of the timeline remained unexplained, investigators would have to determine whether it reflected ordinary human memory or something more significant. That distinction could shape the direction of the entire investigation. And it leads directly to the final phase of our reconstruction, where we separate what the evidence appears to establish from what still remains unanswered. By this point, the investigation had reached a familiar crossroads. Not because investigators had run out of evidence, because they had reached the limits of what one type of evidence could explain. The GPS established movement. The distress call documented a moment in time. Official reports confirmed investigative steps. Now, the challenge was determining how those pieces fit together. This is where experienced investigators slow down, not speed up. When evidence begins to appear inconsistent, the worst mistake is forcing it into a theory. Instead, they ask a different question. What can we actually establish? Let's start there. According to the GPS data, the boat remained at Horn Island for several hours before departing late in the afternoon. That movement is documented. The distress call also places the boat near the western tip of Horn Island during that same general timeframe. Again, those two pieces appear consistent. Then, the GPS shows the vessel gradually increasing speed before returning to the mainland. Still consistent. But investigations aren't built on where evidence agrees. They're built on understanding where questions remain. Because after returning to the mainland, the timeline becomes increasingly complex. The official reports show investigators taking deliberate steps to preserve electronic evidence. Not just from one vessel, but from two. That decision tells us something important. Investigators believed digital navigation data could play a meaningful role in reconstructing the day's events. Because as the available records show, the story did not end when the boat reached shore.